Lord, everywhere present and fill us with all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us and cleanse us of all impurity and save our souls, O good one. Amen. Well, welcome everyone. Glad to have you here again tonight. One of the benefits of doing this over the video is that it doesn't matter how snowy out it is, because here, as I was saying to Peter, there's lots of snow right now. You guys are going to maybe get that a little bit later, but with technology, it doesn't hold us up. So at least in this particular way. So tonight we're going to look at we're back to Abba Dorotheos' practical teaching on the Christian life, and we're looking at lesson 4, which is on the fear of God. This one's a little bit longer. The one we did last week on the conscience was only, I don't know what, 7 pages or something, and it really gave it to us more sort of as a principle that we could then sort of take and apply in different situations. In the fear of God, it's somewhat similar, but he'll go at greater lengths, I think, to spell some things out for us. So I think that can be particularly helpful. As I said the other times, I'm going to read, certain passages and stuff, both to sort of refresh our mind, but for those who haven't had a chance to read or who are sort of following on the internet, who maybe didn't get off of the website the reading, and but hopefully hopefully you guys have some thoughts on this stuff and it's somewhat fresh. I'd like to hear your comments and discussions. And again, I think it's important, as I've said before, that we really kind of wrestle with these things and don't be embarrassed to raise them and say, I don't really understand how this works, or I don't really see how this is applicable to today. And be willing to kind of, I don't know, we might say wrestle a little bit. In the same way Jacob wrestled with God and received a blessing, this is what we have to do even with the Holy Fathers. We need to wrestle with these things and with the Scriptures so that they become our own, and so that we can, begin to digest them, we might say. And so this is a good thing, so don't hold back, and I guess we'll just hop into it. So I'll just start us off again by reading the first paragraph, and in Abba Dorotheos' style, he really seems to kind of sum things up in the first paragraph pretty well, and it lays out sort of the whole project here for us. So I'll just begin at 47. In his Catholic epistle, St. John says, "Perfect love casts out fear." What does the saint mean by this? What does he mean by love and by fear? The prophet in the Psalm says, "O fear the Lord, you his saints." We find many similar sayings in the Holy Scriptures, but if the saints who have such a perfect love of God also fear him, why is it said that perfect love casts out fear? And he goes on to answer it for us in sort of a synopsis version. He says, the saint wants to show us that there are 2 kinds of fear. One is introductory, and the other one is perfect. The first is for the beginners in the Christian life, and whilst the other one is of the saints, of those who have been made perfect and have reached the point of divine love. Let me explain. Somebody does the will of God through fear of hell. He, as we have said, is only a beginner. He's not struggling for good itself, but through fear of infliction. Another person follows God's will because he loves God himself, and specifically because he wants to please him. This person knows what is good. He knows what it means to be together with God. He has the true love, which the saints call perfect, or which the saint rather calls perfect. And it is precisely this perfect love which leads him to perfect fear. He fears and keeps God's will, not because he fears the wounds, not because of hell, but, as we have said, because he has tasted the sweetness of being with God. He is afraid of falling away and being deprived of this sweetness. This perfect fear, which is the result of perfect love, casts out introductory fear. And this is the reason why he says that perfect love casts out fear. It is impossible to reach perfect fear except through introductory fear. So I think this is a very sort of wonderful beginning to this, because these are questions I think that people often have. These are things that people might even say are contradictions in the scriptures. When they say, well, look, on the one hand, we're taught that God is a God of love, and even such things as this, that perfect love casts out fear. And then on the other hand, we hear all the time, especially in the writings of the saints, this necessity to have the fear of God. And, isn't this a contradiction? We shouldn't be afraid of God. And so it's very nice that we have a saint to interpret another saint for us. This is the sort of beauty of the way the church works. And so in this, we see they're making a distinction for us so that we can understand this better, right? And so the distinction is between two kinds of fear, that of the introductory fear and that of the perfect fear. And I really sort of like the point. It's impossible to reach perfect fear except through introductory fear. Generally speaking, this is how everything works within the church. It's impossible to reach illumination if we haven't passed through purification. It's impossible, as St. Paul will talk about, for us to eat solid food if we're still at the level of infants spiritually. Right, and all of these kinds of things, we see these processes, you might say, laid out in the scriptures for us to reinforce, I think, in many ways, what we've already encountered in Abba Dorotheos. And again, as a means of being somewhat encouraging, I think, for us, God knowing what we're like and the struggles that we have in this life, as we remember from Abba Dorotheos on the conscience, where he speaks of the fact that it's in the little things, right? He says, it's in the little thing, either in the step towards holiness or the step towards evil, that we sort of proceed along this road, or that we climb this ladder, if we want to use these kinds of images. And I think this is what we're seeing here again, kind of repeated for us, right? That we need to sort of, as much as possible, be wise in these things so that we can learn to understand how the process works. And it's very important because then we can sort of figure out a little bit better what we ought to expect from ourselves and how we ought to relate to these things. Sometimes I think we ought to be at the perfect stage, not understanding that, no, we ought to be at the stage that we're at until we arrive at that place. This is our goal, this is our destination. But we have to realize the difference between where we are and where it is that we're trying to get to. So before I sort of continue to proceed through, because this is hopefully meant to be a bit more sort of discussion oriented, I'd like to hear if you have any thoughts or any ideas right off the top. What did you feel like when you were reading this in Abba Dorotheos? Did anything strike you? It doesn't have to be about this passage. It can be about the whole reading, about the fear of God in general. I just thought it was nice to sort of begin with this to kind of jog our memories a little bit. This notion of the sort of perfect fear versus introductory fear. But is there any sort of initial, sort of overall comments anyone wanted to make before we keep going through in the sort of particulars of it?
Papa, it looks like the group is contemplative for now.
I see a hand there somewhere.
There's actually there's a question finally now. One sec.
Yeah. Like I said, it doesn't have to be a question. I just want to hear your thoughts or your.
The topic that we were discussing, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine years ago, and I kind of slowly lost touch with him because it's just can't force anyone the faith upon your fellow brother, even if he's an Orthodox Christian. But I was explaining to him about the fear of God, but not in depth as we read in the paragraph just a few minutes ago. And it was difficult for him to understand that, because he's I'm not saying like I'm a dedicated member of the Orthodox Church, but he said, why should I be afraid of God? Like, as a child should be afraid of their parent. That's what comes to mind of the conversation that I had.
And I think this is exactly the kind of point that I was hoping that you guys would be sort of, even yourselves, feeling somewhat when you're reading this. Because we live in the culture that we live in. And it's very natural to have exactly that kind of thought, which is, well, why should I fear God? And why would a child fear their parent? And how can this be a good thing? And it's precisely these kinds of questions, I think, as we begin to look at, how we might answer that, that we get sort of a clearer picture of what fear of God actually means in the context of our faith. And I think it's sort of, a lot of these things are sort of wonderfully dealt with within this, but I think this is something, especially as modern people, more than in other generations, that this is a particularly difficult concept for us to sort of deal with. This notion that we should be afraid or that we should have this fear, and what exactly does that mean? In the same way that maybe concepts like honoring your parents are somewhat more difficult for us in our day than in sort of previous generations, or at least the context of how we view those things change, right? In a previous generation, it might be, honoring your parents might be not speaking to them unless you were spoken to, especially in certain social situations. Whereas, at least with my generation, I can't imagine that would be what honor your parents meant. And so I think it's the same in considering this, fear of God, as our sort of friend raised. I think this is the sort of difficulty, and I think the saint answers this for us in a few different ways, but I think we can kind of look towards seeing the answer to that. Any other comments or even additions to that? Anyone want to respond to? I can't quite see who's who, and I guess I don't really even know all your names, but if anyone else feels like they want to add something or respond to that, that would be great. Or I can continue.
Father, I have a question in reference to what we're talking about. So is fear a technique of God bringing them closer to Him, or what are we talking about here?
Yeah, ultimately, this is a technique for those of us. It's funny. Later on in the reading, he'll talk a lot about boldness, and there's two instances. And I was in a study group doing this, and one of the people in the group raised this question. He said, "Well, here on the one hand, he's praising boldness in this saint, but over here he's saying we ought not to be bold. These two different kinds of boldness." And just thinking about that this evening as I was going over the reading again, I peeked into the index to see, in our book here, what exactly he wrote about boldness in the entry. I was just kind of curious. And one of the things he mentions is that he refers to Adam and Eve actually towards the end of the entry, and says that it was a gift from God, this kind of boldness, and Adam and Eve had it. So that they could speak to God freely, the creator of heaven and earth, as though they were just good friends. This is actually, if we begin to kind of think about what this means, it's actually quite radical. Certainly in our society, where, those that are at the sort of upper echelon of society, very rarely or, only in certain contexts are they going to sort of interact with those at the lowest aspect of society. And it's this kind of boldness, we might say, that is the gift that God gave to our first parents as a means to interact with Him with the kind of closeness that otherwise actually wouldn't really be appropriate. And so when you say, is fear of God a tool, after the fall of human beings, it's certainly a tool, because we don't have that same boldness before God, because we've lost it, basically. And fear of God, it will be, as we'll see, is a means to kind of keep us walking this road, and we'll see that there's different levels of that. So I think this is probably a good point to sort of segue into even just the next paragraph, because it's very important, where Abba Dorotheos will describe to us three states that we might say of the fear of God that lead to us being able to sort of to please Him, and in some ways begin to bridge this gap, so that we can again sort of repair the relationship that has had damage done to it. And so he says in number 48, there are three states as St. Basil says, by which we can please God, either by fearing hell and therefore pleasing him, in which case we're in the state of the slave, or by fulfilling the commandments, or benefiting by seeking the profits that we will receive as reward, in which case we are in the state of wage laborers, or by pleasing God through the love of good, and in that case we are in the state of the sons of God. When a son matures, he does his father's will not because he is afraid of being beaten, nor because he expects a reward from him, but because he loves him. He respects him especially, and he is convinced that everything belonging to his father is his own. This son becomes worthy to hear, "You are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Christ," which is St. Paul in Galatians. As we have said, he no longer fears God. And this sort of quotation goes on, but we'll stop there. So what we're seeing here, I think, on this sort of road back to God, using the fear of God basically as a tool, we might look at it from that perspective. In the same way that God, everything God gives us is a tool for our salvation. Everything God gives us, we might say, is a tool for restoring our health, physical and mainly spiritual, right? And sort of repairing the damage done to the relationship between us and God and us and our neighbor. And so here we see these kind of three states. And I think the third one, I think we can all kind of recognize as sort of making a lot of sense. You know, we please God, you know, through the love of God, for the sake of it. Why do we go to church? Not because we have to, not because, you know, we expect to get some kind of reward, but because we choose to do it because it's something that we like, or something we find valuable. And if we don't find it valuable, then we don't go, right? Or any of these sort of spiritual disciplines. This is a way that, you know, I think a lot of us kind of relate to our relationship with God in general, which is if we like it, we do it, and if we don't like it, we don't do it, right? It's a bit of a misunderstanding of, I think, of this third state, but that's sort of basically where it's at. And I think a lot of people have trouble with the earlier state, right? What was the very first state that I mentioned? Do you guys recall? Someone can call it out and Nico can repeat it. Okay, yeah.
The fear of hell.
The fear of hell, right? The fear of hell. And what does he mean by the fear of hell in particular?
Being away from Christ, heaven.
Okay, yeah, that's sort of it, but he means more the fear of punishment. And this is why he calls it the state of a slave, right? It's not because you have free will. It's not because, you know, you're not doing it because you want to do it. You're doing it because you're afraid to be beat. And he points out, and I think unfortunately it's the reality of most of us sort of look at our lives, that this is definitely the sort of first stage, right? When you think about developing a new habit, we'll put it in that kind of context. You have a New Year's resolution this year, and you decide, I'm going to exercise. How does that exercise look when you begin? You know, I would suggest, at least in my own case, unfortunately, it begins in this kind of, you know, state of a slave, as it were, where I have to really sort of force myself. I have to be sort of beating myself over the head to say, oh, you know, you're not going to be healthy. Oh, you're not going to, you know, lose those few pounds, or, you know, whatever the kind of ways in which we kind of exert that kind of pressure against our will, because that's sort of the first stage of sort of developing that habit, right?
Father, let me interrupt, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
You're bringing up a point of fear because we want to exercise, but isn't that maybe? I'm just asking. Maybe God made us too weak and make us too much of the flesh. Therefore, we're too lazy and we're too fat, because 80 or 60 or a very high percentage is fat and lazy people out there. Mm-hmm. So, like, maybe there's a DNA wrongness here, or something to that effect. I mean, you'd like to be in better shape. I'd like to be in better shape, but maybe made us weak. We're not worthy.
That's part of it. And so.
Was it our fault?
Of course.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I want to hear it.
You know, it's our job to use these sort of tools, as it were, and to sort of make this struggle. That's what it is to be human being, according to the revelation of God. And so it very much is our, it is our fault to a certain degree. But God, realizing just what you said, this sort of real sort of challenge this is for us, He gives us a few kind of steps in order to sort of achieve and get to the place that we want. He doesn't expect us right away to get to this sort of perfect fear. That's why there's a process. He meets us where we are. And unfortunately, the best sort of motivation in the beginning is, I don't want to be punished. I don't want to be cut off. I don't want to miss out. I don't want to, all of these different kinds of ways in the beginning, which we have to kind of use as very sort of exterior means. That's the idea of it being a slave, right? It's imposed upon you. I mean, you may choose the imposing of it, but unfortunately, your will at this point is still enslaved to other things. And so the only way in which to sort of break that is by really forcing it and by using these kinds of means. And then slowly, as we begin to practice that, so again, in the analogy of the exercise, for example, in the beginning, it's all this kind of mental warfare, as you might say, to sort of motivate yourself to do it. But then after you've exercised maybe for a few weeks, right, the struggle hasn't all gone away, but you're starting to feel better, you have more energy, you're feeling stronger, and so you're starting to taste a bit of the benefits. And so now you might say you're beginning to move to this sort of state of the wage laborer, where you do these things because of the good benefit that they're giving to you now, right? And the enjoyment that you're kind of receiving from them. And this is the state that he's talking about at this stage. And so the final stage of that, which is the one we sort of began with, but is we do it not because, I have to sort of beat myself up to do it, because I, don't want to be unhealthy, and not because I only exercise because it feels really good, but I exercise because I know in and of itself this is a good thing for me to do, sort of overall. And that movement to the final stage where we kind of align our mind with, with our desires, as it were, and the two kind of come together. Now, what is Abba Dorotheos talking about here, though, when he's talking about states of the fear of God in this particular context? I use exercise to just kind of, paint the picture for us a little bit. What he's referring to here, though, is following the commandments of God, following the commandments of Christ. And while it might be nice to say we should all love our neighbors just because we all desire, or our enemies actually, because this is a good thing to do in and of itself, and we want what's best for ourselves and for them, and therefore I'm just going to do it. Well, that's all. I mean, that's a great state to be at. But the reality, I think, and the reality that the Holy Scriptures testify to, and that our friend is kind of pointing out, in the weakness of our human nature and the way we find it, is that we need to be trained to do those kinds of things. And so in the earlier stages, the reason why we follow the commandments is precisely because we're afraid to be punished by not doing it. Whether by God because of going to hell or something, or whether by, punished sort of socially because, our family is going to look at us strange, or, our workplace is going to look at us strange if we don't do these things, or whatever, the kind of other versions, of punishment, we might say, that help to sort of motivate our will. But the main point here is that's like the lowest level. This is not where God wants us to be, to do it just, God wants us to do it because it's for our good. And if it has to be, even in that kind of grudging sort of way, He'll take it. He'll use any excuse He can to save us, right? But He doesn't want to leave us there. He wants to take us from being sort of slaves of doing it all unwillingly because God told me to, or because my priest told me to, or because, someone thinks I should. He wants to move us past that. So we move from being children, right, who only know that they can't eat cookies before dinner because their parents tell them they can't eat cookies before dinner. But no parent wants to leave their child in that state. They want to bring them to the point, right, where they understand that, no, it's a good thing in and of itself for other reasons, for you to do this. And ultimately, it's good for you in terms of your sort of health. And this is what God is sort of saying to us. This is good for you for your health. And so he wants to move us there. But Abba Dorotheos is pointing out that this is the sort of stage that we need to walk through. First, we do it somewhat unwillingly. We need to get beyond that. Then we do it because we want heaven, or because we want, because it feels good when we do these things. A lot of the times people, you hear, for example, they gave alms to someone who was poor. They did this sort of wonderful thing. What did they say? It felt wonderful, and I want to do it again, right? And that's a good place to be. It's much better than, oh, well, I have to give money because, it looks bad if I don't, right? That's the state of the slave. We get past that and say, oh, it feels good to do these things and I want to do it more. But even there, we're still not at the highest level. We're not doing it for its own sake. We're doing it because of how it makes us feel, right? And that's a good place to be still. But we want to keep moving forward. We want to sort of continue ascending, as it were. And again, when we talk about ascending, it's not like all the time we're only on this stage or on that stage, right? We kind of move back and forth along the ladder depending on the situation or the particular thing that we're struggling with. But Nico, were you? I saw you raise the mic. I don't know if you were going to make a comment.
No, I was just on a point that was mentioned that, did God make us too weak? And what I'm wondering on that topic is, real quickly, is it because of the fall? Prior to the fall, if I understand correctly, Adam and Eve were in paradise. They got to enjoy everything in paradise. They didn't have to work. It was all given to them. And then maybe, I was just wondering, based on what Donnie said earlier, that maybe because after the fall, yeah, we are weak. And we are too weak. Not that God made us weak, but because of the disobedience of Adam and Eve, and now are inheriting that.
Well, if Christ says, you can do nothing without me, and in Adam and Eve what we find, and in any human being for that matter, but in the movement away from God, this is what happens with Adam and Eve. They move away from God, they lose communion with him, and suddenly they're not able to do things that before they did naturally. And they have all of these weaknesses, and they have all of these struggles. One is a result, I guess, as you're bringing up, Nico, as a result of them just naturally, because of their distance from God, just like with all of us, right? The further we are from God, the less we can sort of, fulfill that word of Christ, which says, "Without me, you can do nothing," because we're away from Him, and therefore there's many things we can't do as a result of that. But the other side of that the fathers teach us is, and Abba Dorotheos in his very first chapter of the book, which we didn't do because it was somewhat long, it's called On Renunciation, and he sort of, in the person of God, he kind of adds and sort of speaks to Adam, as it were, and he's sort of speaking interiorly between the persons of the Holy Trinity, saying about Adam and Eve, these are people who don't know how to be happy. And basically, if I don't give them some kind of struggle, if I don't give them some kind of suffering, they'll never wake up in order to sort of realize the good things that they had, that they were given, and they'll take them for granted. And so they lose their boldness, which, as I will maybe mention if we have time later, part of boldness, I think, is this kind of state of taking things for granted. And it can be in a good way, in the same way that we take for granted that we can say certain things to our friends and get good advice from them and confide in them in a way that we can't with other people. But then there's also take for granted in the negative sense, which is we trample on the people that are closest to us because we take them for granted, right? And so there's these two sides to this, and so I think there's this two sides to the weakness of this human nature, that the fear of God is meant to help heal. And so very much, I think, in the context of a tool or medicine is probably the easiest way to conceive of it. So we'll just go on a little bit further to at the top of the next page. It's in before 50, I guess it's in 49, but on the other page, 111. he gives us a little bit more about how this process then of introductory fear works. If this is the sort of the level that we're at, well, how does it work for us? Well, he says introductory fear is that of our own situation, where most of us find ourselves. This protects the soul from evil, like metal plating. It says that by the fear of the Lord one departs from evil in Proverbs. If somebody turns away from evil through fear of hell, in the same way as the slave fears his master, he then progressively reaches the point of practicing good. So this is sort of what I'm saying. God doesn't want to, God will take it, right? Because, if you're only willing to take your medicine because, you're gonna get in trouble from your doctor, well, God's okay with that in the beginning, right? Because at least you're taking your medicine, and as it says here, you'll begin to progress to the point of practicing this good, of receiving these benefits, and then you'll begin to learn for yourself from experience that these things are good for you and that they bring health for you. And it moves us on to this next. In practicing it, the fear of God, he gradually reaches the hope of receiving a reward for his labor, like the wage laborer. When he persists in rejecting evil because of fear, as we said, like the slave, and from then on practices good through hope, like the wage laborer, and then perseveres in doing good through God's help, being united with him according to his progress, finally, and this is where we really want to get to, he tastes of the sensation of real good and never wants to be separated from it. This is where we get to the point where we are getting to the point of being sons, where we do this because we know it's good, both because we've experienced it and because the thought of losing it is so unbearable. And this is sort of where it's progressing to. But as we see here, the fear of God isn't meant to be something that's harmful for us, right? It's not some form of sort of asceticism or self-denial that's meant to sort of harm us in this kind of twisted way of thinking about it. What does he say? He says introductory fear, he says, this protects the soul from evil, like metal plating. This is armor that God gives us, right? That allows us, by this fear of the Lord, to depart from evil. Because in the beginning, because our wills aren't trained to it, and our desires, we desire things all over the place, even things that are harmful for us, right? The only way to stop those harmful desires in the beginning is to forcefully put restraints on them, right? If you know you have a problem that, every time you go out with friends out to a place that serves alcohol, that every single time you find yourself, going beyond and beyond and beyond with your drinking, so that by the end you're staggering out, right? And your desire, you feel, is still sort of turned to those things. In the beginning, what do you need to do? Well, you have to restrain that desire. Whether it means not being able to go out with to those particular places, maybe you have to go to coffee shops instead. Or whether it's, putting these kind of restraints on yourself as you're drinking, and before you go, you say, no, I'm not having more than so many drinks, because I know after that things turn into a problem for me. Your desire isn't in that in the beginning, right? But this is this force that we exert against ourselves and our own disordered desires is that first step to developing good habits. And by developing good habits, as he says, we reach this point of practicing good. And so this is kind of the process. God doesn't expect us to become saints tonight and tomorrow. He expects us to just take one little step after one little step in the right direction. Get up when we fall, keep taking these little steps, and before we know it, we'll be at this, at this point where we've tasted of it to such a degree that we know we don't want to lose it. And that's the kind of fear that we have. That's this perfect fear. So if in the beginning, the fear of God is the fear of hell, or fear of punishment, we might say, for not doing these things. And if at the next level we move beyond that, right? We grow up a little bit, and we're not just teenagers anymore who will only look at the Bible and say, "Oh, God just tells me all these things I can't do," right? We get a little bit of understanding, and we begin to understand. Okay, God's telling me not to do these things because when I do these things, it causes me problems, right? We're starting to kind of grow up a little bit, as it were, in our understanding. And so sorry, I lost where I was about to go with that. In this process, right, to perfect fear. And so what is this perfect fear? This is what I want to say to you. The perfect fear that he's talking about at this stage, right, is not the fear of punishment. It's not the fear of losing the good rewards that God is going to give us. It's the fear of losing out on this communion with God, which is so amazing, right? It's the fear of doing something that will displease the person you love so much, right? Like, this is what we might say is, what a healthy marriage looks like. In the beginning, you kind of do it because you're kind of trying to woo the person, you're kind of trying to attract them, whatever, right? And then at the later stage, you start doing these things because you enjoy them, and you see that the other person enjoys them, right? But then as you get to this sort of deeper stage of the perfect, we might say, the reason why we do the things we do, and the only kind of fear that we have left, is fear of disappointing this person that we love so much, and that has loved us so much, right? The fear of not being everything that we can be for this person. That is a totally different kind of fear, I hope you can see, from this kind of introductory fear, right? Where you just feel like you're afraid that the person will reject you or something. That is not that's a totally different fear from not being the best I can be because of this person, right? And so this is where we're meant to be, and this is how we're meant to kind of understand this. And that's how perfect love, this sort of higher perfection, can cast out this sort of lower fear that he talked about in the first paragraph. Does anyone want to make a comment to that point? We've gone through quite a bit already. I mean, this is the amazing thing about the saints. I mean, they really kind of break these things down for us. They take us places with it that are a little bit complicated, that are more gray maybe than we're used to when we think about these things. But they really help to kind of unpack it for us and show us the depth that's involved in it. Should I just keep going, or does anyone want to make a comment, or with one another discussion? Yeah.
We have a question at the back.
Sure.
Comment?
Father, I'm understanding what you're saying, and it sounds all good and nice, but the reality is that you mentioned the thing about the wife and searching for that love. At first, there's an introductory love, and then you do the love for the sake of love because you love that person, and you want reciprocation returned back and things like that, and it develops this spiritual love between your mate. And then at the same time, we're relating this to God on a spiritual level of love. It seems that we're sort of talking a lot of theory here and hope it could be that way. But the reality is, to have a wife and to have the issues of the world, whatever they might be, it just seems that it's a struggle of 1 foot forward and 2 backwards, because you need more than just your mental will and the father's stories and things like that. You need, well, you tell me what I need to be able to progress 2 forward and 1 back. So yeah. I'll leave it there.
Perfectly. What you need is the grace of God. The point is, all of these things.
The grace of God doesn't come if you haven't earned it, though.
No, it actually comes before we've ever earned it. It's the exact opposite.
It comes always. We can't earn it. Okay.
As St. John tells us in his first epistle, it's not that we first loved him, but that he first loved us and gave himself for us. Okay? This is what baptism is. This is why we baptize children. Because the grace of God is not dependent on us directly. Okay? Our response to that grace will determine whether or not we can receive it. And that's where it is. It's not that God isn't there. The scriptures tell us God stands at the door and knocks. He's knocking on the door of our hearts in every little situation. So you said, this is very theoretical. Of course, yes, it's very theoretical, because this is how you begin, right? You begin to understand something in theory so that we can then understand how to put it into practice, right? It's sort of the guiding star, as it were, so that we can figure out, okay, how do we do this, right? But it's no use talking about how we do it if we don't know what it is first, right? And this is what we're trying to sort of lay out here. You point out very rightly examples like marriage or things like that. I'm using sort of earthly analogies to make the spiritual realities somewhat more graspable for those of us who have not yet experienced these states, right? Who have only experienced them at a very kind of low level. So you're also very right in pointing out that, these analogies they're very limited, right? And deficient in like 99% of the time, because unfortunately we don't necessarily achieve these kinds of things. But they're never deficient from God's perspective. And we're talking about the spiritual life, and these as spiritual principles, they always hold true. And so from that perspective, we can always put them into practice if we choose to. And the interesting thing about it is that God makes it very clear that, one, He'll allow us to do it, two, He wants us to do it, and three, He'll even do it for us as long as we cooperate. Which is why Christ says, without me you can do nothing. He understands the state that we're in, right? And so He's encouraging us to become close to Him through the means that He gives in order to sort of make this happen, as it were. And so, we can look around and say, well, it doesn't really happen in practice that often. Of course, but that's not a fault in the physician, right? That's a fault in the patient. And usually it's not even a fault in us, like there's something wrong with us that we can't do it. It's not even usually that, right? It's a problem of the will, that most of the time, even though we know it's good for us, or so often of the time, we choose not to do it, right? And the only way to get over this is through practicing. And that's why in the Fathers we see it over and over, and this is all God expects. If we continue to practice, and when we fail, continue to get up, that's all He wants, right? And at the end of the day, He'll find a way to give us these good things and to bring us along this road, and we'll get there before we even realize it, because He'll have brought us there without realizing it. As long as we continue to say, I just want to keep walking the road, God. I just want to keep walking the road. I just want to keep opening the door when you knock. So maybe that helps a little bit, at least with the context of what we're talking about. The second half of this is how we actually apply the fear of God, right? And I think it's very sort of illuminating. We can skip to the end of 51. It's on page 113. He says, we've heard what perfect fear according to the saints is, and what introductory fear of our own situation is, and where we have come from, and what we attained through the fear of God. Now we must learn how the fear of God comes about, and understand what it is that separates us, or that cuts us off from the fear of God, or that drives the fear of God away. So now we're getting into the practical, right? He set it up for us to understand the theoretical, to understand the process, all of this kind of stuff. And now he's going to sum it up for us. And the basic answer, which I found quite interesting for the rest of the entire text, if you looked through and you read each of the things, all of it, other than the very, very beginning here of 52, is about your neighbor. It's all about how you interact with the people around you in your everyday life. This is what will allow you to ascend this ladder. This is what will allow you to reach perfection. And this is what he's laying down for us. So it couldn't be more concrete in that sense, right? The means of our salvation, the means for us sort of acquiring this fear of God in such a way that it will become an armor for our souls, to lead us to union with God and to perfection, is through our neighbor, and even through our enemies, really. So it's intensely practical. And what I mean by that is the people you interact with every day, the people sitting in the room with you right now, the people you're going to go home to that are in your house, or that are in your family members that you're going to meet over Christmas. It's the people that you're going to be on the bus with, or the people you're sitting in traffic with. It's the people in your workplace. These are the people he's referring to. These are the people that are God's instruments for us to acquire every spiritual gift and to acquire salvation. This is what he's giving us opportunities all the time, all around us, right? He's not expecting us to climb mountains. He's giving it to us in the smallest, simplest situations, and he's giving us hundreds of times in which to practice it throughout our days so that we can get good at it. So even if we fail, we say, big deal, and we just keep going, right? And this is how we just get up and keep going. We say, God, help me again this time. I didn't do so well that time. Help me with this next time. So let's peek a little bit. We'll just go back to 52 because he first sort of sets up a little bit about how we can kind of preserve this, how it comes to us. But then he'll go on to talk about his neighbor, and we'll sort of focus on that. The Fathers said in 52 that man obtains fear of God when he has 1, the remembrance of death, and 2, the remembrance of hell, when he 3, searches himself every evening as to how he spent the day, and again he searches himself every morning as to how he spent the night. It is also when 4, he does not act with undue boldness, but clings to a man, we could say a person really, that fears God. And this is a wonderful little quote here. It is said that a certain brother asked an elder, "What shall I do, Father, in order to fear God?" The elder answered, "Go and cling to a man who fears God, and from the fact that he fears him, he will teach you to do likewise." So first of all, I'd like to ask you about that. What do we make of this passage? What is he saying here? The elder answered that the way to learn the fear of God, go and cling to a man who fears God, and from the fact that he fears him, he will teach you to do likewise. Thoughts on that? I wondered if that stood out for anyone.
Yeah, Father, the book is written mostly for monks, I think, but in the world, how do you find these people? Personally, I'm stuck in the state of a slave, and I can't seem to get past that. But pray for me. But I know when you were talking about praxis, they were talking about at the higher levels to actually get on and do stuff. It comes later in the text, I think. But if you're in the earlier stages, other than just avoiding sin, what types of things can you do as well? And if you're in the world, where do you find these people?
Exactly. These are the questions, right? Where do we find these people? Well, the first place that we need to look, first off, is we have to understand people like Abba Dorotheos, or the Synaxarion, or the writings of the saints, at least to a certain degree, so that we can have a meter, first of all, to gauge how do we discover a person like this in the first place, right? We need some standard, first of all, by which to kind of measure them by. And the church gives us sort of ample things by which we can do that. Our whole tradition is, filled with these kinds of resources, we might say, that help us to kind of figure that out. But I would suggest to you exactly in the kinds of things you're doing this evening. These are where you're going to sort of, outside of the monastic context, find these kinds of people, right? Because in our interactions, for example, the body as the body of Christ means that we're all members, we're all different, and yet we're all part of this one body. And some people have strengths that we don't have. And we have other strengths and gifts that God has given us, or ways in which we've found to struggle with certain things that other people haven't had. And so by even developing, especially in this context of being in the world and things like that, we can develop spiritual friendships with people that we see a particular virtue that really shines out in them, right? And we think to ourselves, I really want to be like that person. And so we find ways in which to kind of interact with them, so that we can learn from them, so that we can become sort of close to these people and sort of soak that up from them. That's a very sort of practical kind of everyday way that I might suggest that we can kind of do this. Okay. The other ways I think are, we can travel to do this too, right? We can go to places of holiness. We can visit holy sites. We can visit places where people have given them their whole selves to sort of trying to live out this spiritual life and attempt in that way to kind of absorb as much as we can. So what I'm thinking mainly is, visits to monasteries and things like that. This can be a great way. We talk about sort of recharging our spiritual battery. I mean, this is kind of a phrase we'd hear. You visit a monastery to sort of recharge your spiritual battery. Well, this is the same kind of thing. So say we're not in a situation to, quote-unquote, cling to one person. Well, then we can cling to a monastery in the sense that we can be close to them. And, we can visit them and we can absorb as much as possible from those people. We can do the same thing with people in our church, possibly with our priests to a certain degree, though obviously priests are very busy and have to sort of, share that with everyone, which is why I think spiritual friendship, people of like mind who are struggling, that like we see in St. Basil and St. Gregory, when we read their sort of early lives of them, the way in which they kind of struggled as spiritual friends. These are all ways in which I think we can take this, which is somewhat monastic, as you point out, and apply it to our own sort of situation. It doesn't mean we have to live with them, right? It doesn't mean that we have to, have them tell us this, that, and the other thing of everything what to do, right? What he's telling us here is that one of the main ways that we can learn to benefit from one another is just by paying attention, is by being open to the gifts that other people have around us as much as possible. And a lot of what that is we stop looking in and we start looking out. When we start looking out at all of the gifts that our neighbors have, then we can begin to sort of absorb these things, as it were, without them ever teaching us. And I think that's what's so significant about this. He's not talking about being taught by words. He's being told to be taught by actions. And this is why this passage especially stood out to me. It's a beautiful kind of thing for us to begin to do. Talk less and act more. And especially when we get into the situation where we feel like we want to become teachers, okay, great. So let's teach with our actions, right? Let's follow the example of St. Seraphim of Seraph, who said, become holy and 1,000 around you will, be saved, who will become holy. This is the Orthodox way, I think, to kind of strive for these things. So anyway, that would be how I don't know if that helps exactly, but that would be my sort of thought for our situation. This is the important thing about this text. Yes, it's written for monastics, but as I've sort of said already, everything he's saying we can take in principle and apply it to our own lives, easily apply it to our own lives. Most of what he's quoting is directly from the scriptures. How can it not apply to us, right? There isn't a different spiritual sort of handbook for the monks and for the lay people. The scriptures are the same for the lay people and for the monastics. The way in which that gets carried out, the particulars will look a little bit different, right? Just like the particulars of how you guys all live your spiritual life in Toronto looks a little different than how I live my spiritual life in Kingston, right? But it's the same life that we're called to. Any other comments before we continue going on? Okay, we'll push on then. So, after he sort of says this for us, he says a little bit further down how we can lose this fear of God that we're trying to cultivate, right? Because it's an armor that protects us from evil. It's this ability to sort of lead us to perfection and keep us from sin and all of these things that we know are harmful for ourselves. He says we expel fear of God from ourselves. We drive it away when we do the contrary. That is, when we have neither remembrance of death nor of hell, when we do not examine ourselves, we do not question ourselves as to how we spend our lives, but we live indifferently and we keep company with those who are indifferent. And so he's pointing out here this sort of notion that if we want to learn to acquire the virtues, we need to surround ourselves with like-minded people who also want to acquire the virtues, who also want to live a Christ-like life, right? And I mean, it's just natural, right? You spend more of your time with people that have similar interests with you. This isn't an evil thing. This is a human thing. right? And I think if we look at our relationships, this is exactly what we see, right? The basketball players like to be with the basketball players or the sports players, the people who like reading, they start book clubs. The people who, like outdoors things, they form together into these kinds of clubs. This is natural, all right? And this is what the saint is encouraging us to do. And he's saying if we don't do that, then what's going to happen unwittingly, whether we want to or not, is we're going to sort of drive this fear of God away, slowly drive it away. Okay? Now is where he really he gets into the main sort of point of what's the main way in which we're going to lose any of this progress we make. Well, he says, moreover, when we are unduly bold, this is the worst. This is a complete loss. What can expel fear of God from the soul more than boldness? This is why when Abba Agathon was asked about boldness, he said that it is like burning heat, which everyone flees from when it comes, and which destroys the fruits of the trees. Do you see, Father, the power of this passion? Do you see its wrath? When he was asked again, he said, yes, boldness is that bad. There is no passion worse than boldness. It is the mother of all passions. And he says, it was rightly said with much understanding that boldness is the mother of all passions, since it expels the fear of God from the soul. If one departs from evil by the fear of the Lord, then certainly every passion exists where there is no fear of God. God delivers our souls from the destructive passion of, may God deliver our souls from the destructive passion of boldness. And so, again, this is where we were sort of talking before, this boldness. There's a good boldness, the boldness that the saints have, where St. Paul says the saints judge all things and are judged by no one, because they live in a way that it's very difficult for those of us who don't live that life to understand, which is why we look at them as though they're crazy, right? We think about the monks on Mount Athos, and we might admire it, but most people think they're insane, absolutely insane, out of their minds, right? Who would ever possibly do this kind of thing? Remove themselves from the world, eat less, stay up all night in prayer, wear themselves down with hard physical labor, right? This is kind of insanity, as it were, from the standards of the world, okay? But the boldness that he's speaking about here is this sort of opposite side of boldness, which I said, if boldness is taking people or things for granted, like I said, it can be a good thing, right? Where it means we have trust for someone. But it's also this other negative side, and this is what he's pointing to, which is where we take them for granted and we disrespect them, right? Or we trample on them. I mean, it's kind of an ironic thing that the people who are the closest in our lives and that are the closest to us are the people we tend to hurt the most, right? I mean, if you think of the kind of the worst kind of struggles in your life or the conflicts in your life, generally speaking, they're with the people that are closest to you. At least it's in my experience and in the experience of almost everyone I know. These are the people that we have these struggles with, right? These are the relationships that we have problems with. These are the people that we're confessing about our anger or our, irritation or our impatience, all of these kinds of things, right? And the reason for this is because of this boldness we're talking about. Because we take them for granted, both in the good way sometimes, but it's because of that good way that we so easily slip into taking them for granted in this really kind of negative way. And so the saint will tell us, look, boldness is expressed in a ton of ways, right? He says one can be bold through word, right? Through touch, through looks. This is a great one, right? We say, well, I didn't say anything, right? Oh, no, you didn't say anything, but it was written all over your face, right? And so this is what the saint is sort of pointing out, right? We can say more with a look many times, right? Someone walks into the church and they don't look the way we think they ought to look, or someone on the street, and it's written all over our face what we think about this person. And God forbid they would see our face, because they would know, right? And anyone else who sees our face knows what we mean by it. This is the boldness he's talking about. Through boldness, one comes to talk idly, to discuss worldly things, to do ridiculous things, right? And to cause immodest laughter. And in this particular case, I mean, these are things I think that can stand out for us. the kind of a modest laughter, certainly in our generation, is, humor can be very crude, right? And yet, it's very easy to fall into that kind of crude humor when you're joking around in the office, in the workplace with everyone else joking that same way. And we don't catch ourselves till after the fact falling into these kinds of things. This is a kind of boldness. It often happens with people that we, consider friends, right? We kind of get into this joking sort of thing, interaction, and it goes to places we don't intend it to initially. And then a lot of the times we just let it go as it will. This is the boldness he's saying. This kind of brazenness, he says, drives away the fear of God from the soul. And he says from this, one will gradually, if we continue to do this, if we continue to judge our neighbor, if we continue to not pay attention to the little things, right? If we continue to sort of indulge in these things that we know aren't particularly useful for us or for other people, he says one gradually reaches total disdain of God. And this is just back to Abba Dorotheos on the conscience. It's in the little things. He's just sort of repeating that here in a different form, right? And so if we can kind of get those things under control, then we can keep a healthy fear of God, meaning a healthy, I phrase it the opposite way, desire for salvation, right? An awareness of God, that God is there with us all the time, right? Would you want to act like that in front of him if he was standing there visibly so you could see him? How much would your actions change? How much would my actions change? If I saw him with me, next to me all the time, would I honestly say I'll act exactly the same? And so this is what he's saying. He's saying by doing these actions, we drive out the awareness that God is actually present, everywhere present, fills to all things, right? And yet, so by keeping this remembrance, it helps us from falling into these things that, at the end of the day, don't contribute to our spiritual health, but actually sort of lead away from that. He goes through, he gives, more examples basically of the same one. I just want to see if there's one or two to mention. We're kind of getting on, so. Oh, here's a wonderful one. The one on page 54. This is a great one. So, just down from 54, right? The second paragraph in 54. If somebody happens to see his brother committing a sin, did you guys remember this one? Who sees his brother committing a sin, he should not scorn him and keep silence, leaving him to be lost, nor should he revile or slander him. Rather, he should, with sympathy and the fear of God, inform somebody who is able to correct him, or he should speak with him himself. How should he speak with them? With boldness? No, with love and humility, right? Saying, forgive me, brother, since I'm a careless person myself. I see that perhaps we are not doing this too well. We're not necessarily going to use these exact words, right? But you see the kind of gentleness with which he's trying to help to correct his brother, right? His neighbor, his friend, his relative, okay? And this is a good thing. He's pointing it out to us. But, as we'll see, if he does not listen to him, he should talk to someone else who he trusts, his supervisor or his Abba, depending on the gravity of the mistake. And then what should he do? Oh, he should forget about it, other than in the context of prayer. Certainly you can continue to pray about the person, but we forget about the sort of mistake, right? We don't let it continue to sort of run within our minds. However, as we said, and this is the kicker, however, as we said, he must have the intention of setting his brother straight, not of gossip, nor of slander, yet of wanting to make an example of him, or to criticize or destroy him. He should not pretend that he intends to set him straight when he has no such intention in his heart. Indeed, if somebody talks to his Abba without wanting the correction of his neighbor, or because he himself was scandalized, it is a sin. It is slander. This is the we're talking about the edge of a knife here, right? Between desiring what's best for someone and wanting to help them, but desiring it for the right reasons. And this is what's can be very difficult to discern, right? But what the saint is sort of suggesting to us is we need to be doing this constantly. When we think we're going to say something to someone, the first thought we should be asking ourselves, God, am I doing this because I want to be right? You know, am I doing this because, you know, I think this is best for that person? Or because I actually have their good, their feelings, their struggles, all of their context, we might say, in mind? Right? This is what we need to ask ourselves. And we have to be very careful, right? The Saint Theophan, I think, is one of the many who say it. But talk about that. If we correct and try to correct someone, and we're not doing it out of love, the person won't be able to receive that correction. You know, how many times do we feel like we need to correct someone, and we do it, and it turns into this sort of big explosion, right? I mean, is this is this speaking from love? You know, we want to preach the truth or something, and yet we turn to the point where, you know, we're foaming at the mouth, where everyone is agitated, where, you know, no one feels good about the situation. I mean, would it not have been better not to say anything at all than to have taken it from here to here, you know, in terms of its intensity? I mean, these are the kinds of things that the saint is encouraging us to be considering and praying about. And this is how we keep the fear of God, because we ask God, am I doing this for your sake, Lord, and for their sake, or for my sake? This preserves the fear of God, right? This references everything to God. This recalls God constantly, and our neighbor, doing what's best for them and what's best for us in that context. You know, asking somebody else who you can trust for advice, or confiding in someone else who can do something about it, is also a wonderful way. We have to be very careful with that as well, right? Sometimes it's not our place. Sometimes we just want to pass on, as he says, the gossip to someone else to tell them they shouldn't do that, right? Not a good place to be in, because people can feel very betrayed by that kind of thing, right? Sure, questions, please. I can't hear anything. All right, I'm not hearing you guys. Can you guys hear me? Oh, there we go. I can hear you now.
All right. We missed the last part. It was mumbled. It broke.
Okay. The last part. Right about where? Sorry. Sorry?
Why we have to be careful with that method?
Right. Why
we have to be careful with the method.
Okay. Okay, we have to be careful with it because of our motivations, right? We have to be careful with it because when we pass on this information to somebody else, thinking that we're doing it for someone's good even, we can hurt someone really badly. So someone is doing something that you feel is wrong or whatever, and you, without a lot of discernment and not the fear of God and not asking God in advance to guide your actions, you go and you tell somebody, right? Maybe it was motivated by gossip, maybe it wasn't even. But that other person finding out, you know, can be a real betrayal to the person who you went and told on. You know, we have to be very careful that it's our place to correct people, right? We all know the story of the angel and the holy priest who he always saw his guardian angel. Every time he did the liturgy, he was a simple priest. He always saw his guardian angel there when he was preparing the gifts for Holy Communion. And one time the bishop came after he had been, you know, he had done the proskymidi, the preparation of the bread and the wine. There's a whole service for it. And the priest had actually done part of it backwards. You had to put it on the left, and he put it on the right, or whatever. Okay. And the bishop says to him, Father, no, you're doing that backwards. Oh, and he says, oh, sorry, and he switches it from that point onward. And the next day, or the next time he's celebrating liturgy again, he starts doing the preparation of the gifts, and he sees his angel there, and he does it the way the bishop told him. And what does the angel say? Bravo, Papa! You did it! You did it right! And he turns to him and he says, what? Why didn't you tell me I've been doing it wrong this entire time? And he says, oh, no, Father. I'm an angel. That's not my place to correct a priest. In this sort of situation. And so what we're seeing is we have to be asking ourselves that question too. Is God calling me to say something? Is it my place to say something? And ought I, for the good of this person, to say something? And be wrestling with this stuff. And by doing this, we'll preserve our own conscience. We'll preserve the fear of God in the sense of not wanting to do anything against our neighbor, that would harm them, which is part of the fear of God, keeping the commandments of God. The greatest commandments are to love God and to love our neighbor. And so if we have this fear of keeping these commandments, then we'll be especially concerned about not trampling on our brothers and sisters. And so this is sort of pointing out. And the sort of important thing of once we pass it on, really, if we do get to that point, then we need to leave it behind and only sort of continue to pray for the person, forgetting whatever the misdeed may or may not have been, in the sense of it not becomes a point of obsession for us.
So, Papa, would you say, Papa, then in simple terms, it's the how?
Oh, it's definitely the how, yeah. It's the how, it's the intention, and a lot of it is about the mindfulness of God in doing things, right? Like the how is contained within the how is this main point, which is we need to be referring everything we do to God, even if only briefly, right? God, what should I do? Okay, I'll do it. And the more practice we get at doing that kind of sort of quick reflecting, turning it to God, the easier it will to do it faster without even thinking about it, right? And the easier it will be for us to do things right. And we'll see things begin to become blessed because we're always invoking God to be a part of that process. And so even when we would do something wrong, it will work out for good. Okay? And these are the kinds of things that we need to remember, that God brings good out of evil all the time. And so how much more good will he bring out of our actions, whether done well or not, if we are referring to them, referring to him for help in all of these things. So more than that, I mean, there's more in this that we could go through. A lot about guarding the conscience, a lot about humility. I mean, all this, the whole spiritual life, it's not one or the other. It's not up the ladder or down the ladder, right? A lot of these things are kind of happening all together, right? Some days we do something better, some days we do things worse. In terms of these states, yeah, we might say we're generally at one particular state, but that doesn't preclude us from, for example, at times doing things because we really love God. Like maybe it's only a moment, maybe we only feel it strongly in certain times, and maybe we don't do it as our habit or as our state, but it still happens. It's the same thing. We use the language of purification, illumination, and deification, or union with God, or something like that. But as Elder Sophrony sort of points out, every touch of grace is at the same time purifying and illuminating and deifying and transforming us with God, even if we can still sort of say, I'm at this state, though, as it were, in the sense that this is sort of where my habits fall and where I fall spiritually most of the time, or something like that. So we can't get too caught up like that it goes A, B, C, D. There's no recipes in the spiritual life, as one important spiritual father said. There's well-trodden paths, right? But it has to be unique for everyone. That's why we have doctors or spiritual doctors, right? The medicine is all the same, but the dosages are different for everyone, right? Depending on what their situation is. So probably we're getting on in time, so probably we'll stop it there. I'll just sort of again make the sort of same point again. Abba Dorotheos here. I'll read this last little bit. He says on the final page. second to the last paragraph, the very last line of that paragraph. You know very well that in the sayings of the fathers it is written in that life or death depends on your neighbor. And this is a wonderful sort of principle of the spiritual life. You know, God gives us the means of serving Him by serving others. God gives us the means of saving ourselves in the context of the people around us. We don't have to go off to become monks on Mount Athos or in the Egyptian desert in order to become saints, in order to find closeness with God. We can find it in the busyness of our daily lives, in all of these opportunities that God offers to us, as long as we decide to respond to that knocking on the door. He'll be there constantly, to continue to encourage us, to help us. All we have to do is say, yes, I want that help. Yes, I want to continue. And use the means that He gives for us in order to sort of be able to do that. And that's what we've been talking about. Paying attention to humility, paying attention to our conscience, paying attention to the fear of God in the sense of not following His commandments, in the sense of doing something that would disappoint Him. All of these kinds of things. These are things He gives to us as means for which to sort of do this, most of which are within ourselves, right? In the way in which we relate, even in our own thoughts, with the people around us. So I think that's sort of a wonderful way. If you want to know how to sort of preserve the fear of God, well, preserve it by not trampling on the people around you, by not trampling on your neighbors. It reminded me of 1 John, where he says, if a man says, I love God, yet hates his brother, he is a liar, in that he does not love God. For he that loveth not his brother, whom he hath seen, how can he love God, whom he hath not seen? This is the word of the apostle to us, right? This is what it means to live within the body of Christ, and each of us individually members, right? We're going to be saved together. That's the goal. No matter what, that's the only way to salvation, is going to be through the help of our neighbor and through us helping our neighbors. This is why we pray for one another, right? This is why we do things in communion together. This is what communion itself means. So we'll stop there, but questions, comments, things that are, these are things we need to think about, which is why I want you to be reading these things in advance. Because if we don't read them in advance, and we don't pray about them, and we're not mulling them over, there's no chance that we're going to just be able to absorb what it is that is being sort of given to us, any more than we can learn the fear of God by standing next to a saint for 2 minutes.
Father,
yes.
I'd like to interject and say something in reference to what we were just talking. It seems to me that we've used words like boldness. I think the appropriate word for me, at least, would have been ego instead of boldness. It's man's ego, our individual boldness, which, for instance, we want to help our neighbor, and our neighbor could be our wife, our children, our people at church, and it seems to me that you're saying for us to be politically correct, or very delicate and very tender and very soft to get our point across to an individual that we do care if they're, say, for instance, they're a smoker and they happen to be your wife that just constantly does that, and with love and through 20 years of ongoing same scenario, you're stuck in a rut that's beyond repair, and therefore how do you proceed? How do you go forward knowing that you are not contributing to your personal salvation, your neighborly salvation, or to anything for that matter? Because again, we have to do it with tenderness and ways that are not part of the world, or the world doesn't listen, or we're just in a state of lostness or unawareness or insensitivity or techie, or too much texting, or too much blindness, or too much deafness. So I mean, it's nice to hear it, and I understand what you're saying, but the practical sense for me as an individual, it seems that it's a challenge that sometimes cannot be fulfilled.
Of course, not today.
Not today,
But this
but
is the point. This is the entire point, right? I mean, you touched on a lot of things in what you said. Okay, it would be maybe difficult to respond to them all, but there's at least two sort of points I would like to hit on. The one is the point where you say, well, I can't do this and I can't do that and I can't do the other things because of all these kinds of weaknesses, right? So what you're telling me is not what you're telling me. I mean, you're voicing this, but what you're saying is you can't do this kind of basic kind of thing where in your head you had the thought to judge another person, and you can't say in your thought, don't do that. That's all. These are the first stages of changing our behavior. You can't have a desire and say, come on, no, you shouldn't do this time, right? We're in a fast. You go by the McDonald's, man, it'd be easy just going to have a hamburger. Can't we say to ourselves, no? Like those beginning stages are what is going to move us to the point where suddenly we see our lives are transformed, right? It's through these little interactions all the time that we make this progress. This is the only means, right? But at the same time, we don't really, on the one hand, we don't have an excuse, and on the other hand, we don't have to hold ourselves to expectations that are unrealistic. God does not expect you to become a saint right now. He understands that you're where you are, and he's going to try to help you walk along that path, okay? But you have to take the little steps. So you say, we can't do this, or nothing changes. Fine, it won't change until we start wrestling up here in our thoughts. And the more we do that, the more we say no in the little things, or yes in the little things, the easier it will become to do it in situations that in the past we never thought we could do. Okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is we have to be asking ourselves, is it my place to be correcting people? Is it my place to go up to someone and say, you need to do this, that, and the other thing? Right? The fathers teach it's not my place to do that. Mainly for the one reason, Abba Dorotheos himself says it. But there's I think it's Abba Penney. He sort of famously quoted when he saw someone fall into sin. The way he kept him, he was a saint, okay? But the way he kept himself from judging this person is, what did he say? He said, him today, me tomorrow. And he protected himself from judging by that one little thought to say, we think we're in a position to go run over and correct people all the time. And the reality is, sure we are, if we've done what the scriptures say, which is removed the beam out of our own eye, and then we're ready to go remove the splinter out of someone else's. This is why Abba Dorotheos is focusing so much on action, because it's not dependent on what other people do. It's only dependent on how we respond to them or how we interact with them. There's always ways for us to sort of win these spiritual crowns, we might say, to become spiritual healthy, to overcome these bad habits and turn them into good habits. But the only way we can do that is if we start to change the way we think. The very first way we need to change the way we think is to think, I can't change. It's not true. All of the saints in the church testify to the fact that it's not true. Read the life of Moses the Black to see it's not true, right? People who are bloodthirsty murderers and rapists, who were, prostitutes like Mary of Egypt, who were able to go and become the greatest saints of our church, not in one day. St. Mary was in the desert for 40 years or 50 years, right? And so, we need to understand these things and understand the way to engage in this struggle, the way to sort of move forward in that. Of course we need to sort of again, it's a taking discernment, right? When should we correct someone? You talk about your wife smoking or someone else who has a bad habit. Of course, you should say stuff to people in certain circumstances, right? But think of yourself as Elder Joseph the Hesychist says. How are you corrected most often, right? I'm not saying this directly to you. You just asked the question. I'm just saying, how are we most directly, often corrected? With angry words, or with compassion, with sweetness? What brings us sort of along this? What do we prefer to hear, right? And they're sort of pointing out, as Elder Joseph is, he lived in, he died in 1958. He's contemporary almost with us. And he's just pointing out this point that if the goal is to bring someone to correction, to bring them to spiritual health, then we need to be asking ourselves how best to do it. And the situation will dictate how best. And so sometimes, yeah, that's being politically correct and, talking nicely or not saying anything at all. And other times, it's the complete opposite, right? It's being confrontational. It's saying, no, that isn't the way it is, or no, it should be like this, and getting upset even, right? Anger is not wrong, but the fathers teach the way that we should have anger is anger against sin. That's what the purpose of anger is for, right? And chiefly against sin within ourselves. It's so easy to be angry at other people's sins, isn't it? Right? But we don't expect that same anger towards our own sins, and we certainly don't practice it. It's easy to judge other people. How often do we condemn ourselves for the exact same behavior? Right? This is the whole principle of him today, me tomorrow. Right? As a means of realizing where we are and realizing the kind of situations, and the struggles that God has given us so that we can progress, and not expecting to have this easy road. We all want it easy, right? Can we have a pill that does it for us? Right? Can we have it fast? Because this is what we want. None of us wants to put in the work, that is often required. And that's a symptom, unfortunately, of our generation in some ways, and of human nature in other ways, and of a whole bunch of things, right? But this is the reality. We live a comfortable life. And this is the way we like things to be. And this is how we want things to be in the spiritual life as well, right? This is why we spend, well, anyway, I think you get my point. So it may not be a full answer, but the difficult thing, again, with the spiritual life, there's no recipes, there's no black and white per se. It depends on the situation, it depends on our intention. But I will say, we tend to think it's our duty to speak a lot more than it is. A lot more than it is.
Pamu, thank you so much for spending your time again with us. And God willing, we'll see you after the Nativity or after Christmas. So you gave us a pre-Christmas gift, sharing us Abba Dorotheos, whose name is a gift from God. So Theos Koresi for all of that. And God willing, like I said, in the new year, we'll figure out when. We'll enjoy speaking and sharing time with you again. If we could ask for your brief prayers to close, it'd be great.
Very good. Thanks, everyone. Let me bring it up here. O Christ, the true light, who dost enlighten and sanctify every man that cometh into the world, let the light of thy countenance be signed upon us, that in it we may see the unapproachable light, and guide our steps in the performance of thy commandments, through the intercessions of thine all-immaculate Mother, and of all the saints, and of our Father among the saints, Abba Dorotheos of Gaza. Amen. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening and a safe drive home if the snow has already begun.
Okay.